Faith by David Farrow. "Have you ever seen an angel?" the man asked. Father Damien glanced up from his hymnal, startled. "Excuse me?" he said. It was the first time the man in the black jacket had spoken since he'd walked into the chapel, and the priest wasn't sure he'd heard him right. "I said, have you ever seen an angel?" the man repeated. "Because I have. I saw one just the other day, and I haven't been able to sleep since." Father Damien rested the hymnal on the chair beside him and took a closer look at the stranger in the next row. He looked like he was dressed up for work, although the poor man was a bit of a mess. There was weak old stubble growing on his chin, and he seemed incapable of sitting still. If he wasn't tapping his foot on the floor or fidgeting in his seat, he was playing with the end of his tie, kneading it through his fingers over and over again. "What's your name, son?" Father Damien asked. The man cleared his throat. "Richard," he answered after a long pause. "Richard McLean." He seemed reluctant to say anything else, although his eyes flicked to the stained glass windows above the altar. Whatever he saw up there made him shiver. "Why don't you tell me what you saw?" Father Damien said, lowering his voice to a murmur. He'd seen people like Richard come to confession enough times to know that the best course of action was to speak softly and only ask questions. "I was just driving home from work," Richard answered. "The traffic was getting pretty heavy, and I was kind of pissed, because I wanted to get home before the sun went down. I'd gotten all the way to the Tapansi Bridge when everything just kind of grinded to a halt. It'd been a long day, and I seriously wasn't in the mood, While everyone else sat around grumbling in their cars, I got out and went to see what was the holdup." "So, what was it?" Damien asked. "It was an accident, and not just any accident either. The car was mashed against the side of the bridge, basically a dented hunk of metal. It sobered me up real fast." Father Damien raised an eyebrow at that, but Richard seemed too swept up in his story to notice. "And this guy was laying in the wreckage. He was twisted up bad, Father, like one of those bodies you see in movies and cop shows, His neck was bent back way too far, and there was this huge puddle of blood spreading everywhere. A few cops were standing around yelling into their radios, but no one was doing anything to help the guy. I think they knew he'd already checked out." Richard paused for a moment, closing his eyes. "A couple other people had joined us, trying to see the accident, but there was this one guy who didn't look right. He was wearing this stiff gray suit, and he was just staring down at the body, totally silent. He didn't look shocked or surprised or disgusted or anything. He was just staring. I kind of got the sense that he was waiting for something. And then the dead guy, he started to choke, So I guess he wasn't really dead after all. Cops started freaking out and shouting for an ambulance. But before they could do much of anything, the guy in the gray suit walked up to the body and leaned down next to it. And he put his fingers on the man's chest, and all I can remember thinking was, wow, that guy has pale hands. Seriously, they were practically white, like snow. I don't think the stuff that happened next weirded me out nearly as much as those hands. Then he..." Richard seemed unable to say any more. He was clenching his jaw so hard his cheeks had started to turn red. "Go on," Father Damien said. "What happened next? What did he do?" "He stuck his hands into the guy's chest," Richard answered. "I'm pretty sure I shouted out or something, but I can't remember. All I knew was that the man in the gray suit had his arms inside the body all the way up to the elbows, even though I couldn't see a wound in the guy's body or any kind of hole at all, really. And then he pulled out his hands, and he was holding this little ball of light. It was tiny, but man, it was blinding. I couldn't look right at it." He took a steadying breath. "You want to hear the weirdest part, though? Nobody else saw it happen." Father Damien wrinkled his brow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, that light should have blinded everyone else standing around. Nobody cried out or covered their eyes or even looked away. And I'm positive nobody saw that as soon as the man pulled out that light, the guy on the ground stopped moving." Father Damien was quiet for a moment. "What are you saying, Richard?" he asked. "The guy in the suit was some kind of angel. That's what I'm saying. He took that guy's, I don't know, his soul or something, and just walked away with it. I wanted to follow him, but I was too scared to move. I just watched as he strolled off down the bridge, and you know what? Just before I lost sight of him, I saw his wings. Not big, feathery type wings, more of this wispy outline, not solid, not quite there. I could only see it in the mist. He threw up his arms as if to say, "There, that's my story." It had been an impressive show, Father Damien had to admit, although it had taken its toll on the poor man. Richard's eyes were wide and ringed by lack of sleep, and in his excitement, he had started to breathe more heavily. His breaths had a moist, heaving quality, and the priest was reminded of the offhand remark Richard had thrown out at the beginning of his story. "You said the sight of the accident sobered you up," Father Damien said. "Were you drinking, Richard?" The man's face flushed a deep red. Well, he stammered. "I may have been drinking, yeah. Sometimes I keep a flask in the car in case it's a long ride home. Work's just so stressful, you know. I got so much to deal with. Sometimes I can't wait till I get home to get a drink. That's not the point. I know what I saw." Father Damien was silent. You know what you think you saw, he thought wearily. He'd seen people like Richard 100 times before. They were just a bundle of nerves, unreliable at best, always itching for that next drink or that next sweet high. Sure enough, Richard had begun fidgeting in his seat, sweat breaking out on his forehead. He fumbled in the pocket of his jacket, pulling out a package of cigarettes and a beaten red lighter. His fingers were trembling as he plucked a cigarette from the pack and stuck it between his lips. "You mind if I take a smoke?" he asked. Of course I mind, Father Damien thought in disbelief. This is a church, for Christ's sake. But he kept his mouth shut. He knew this man would never relax if he didn't get his fix. He could always sweep up the ashes and spray the place with a heavy dose of air freshener, and no one would ever have to know. Richard flicked the lighter and raised the tiny flame to the end of his cigarette, but he stopped suddenly, a horrified look spreading across his face. "What am I doing?" he muttered. He spat the cigarette from his mouth and crammed it back in the package. Before he returned the box to his pocket, he stared blankly down at it, as if the red and white logo was a window into the past. Father Damien could almost see the memory of the man in the gray suit reflected in Richard's eyes. He was scared for his life, the priest realized, scared and humbled. To his surprise, Damien felt a smile lift the corners of his lips. When was the last time he had smiled? An actual, genuine smile, not the phony smile he flashed to his congregation during sermons. It must have been a miracle. "Maybe this is a sign," he said at last. "Maybe someone's watching over you, son. This could be the Lord's way of telling you to turn your life around." Richard looked up at him. "You really think so, Father?" Damien paused. "You just have to have faith," he said. "God works in mysterious ways, yeah, I know," Richard finished. He was silent for a moment. He lifted his eyes to the stained glass window, where the evening light lit up the angelic faces of the saints. "Thanks, Father," he said at last. After a moment's hesitation, Damien placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Go," he murmured. "Live your life. Never forget that God is always with you." Richard nodded, his eyes glazed and distant. "I won't," he said. "I won't forget, Father." They stayed that way for a few moments, but eventually Richard excused himself, gathering up his jacket and sliding out of the pew. He made his way down the aisle, his shoes padding against the carpet, glancing back only once at Father Damien. Then he was gone. The priest sighed, getting up from his own seat and walking toward the altar. He supposed he should tidy the place up a bit before he headed home, so he reached behind the curtain under the tabernacle, where he'd stashed the bucket of cleaning supplies. As he did so, his thoughts turned back to Richard's story, to that eerie image of the pale man in his suit. He wondered why the twitchy little man held such a fascination for him. He was nothing special, really, just another drunk claiming to have seen the act of God. "Now hold on," a little voice in his head tried to argue. "You've seen plenty of drunks come through these doors, but this guy wasn't one of them. Was he fidgety? Nervous? Sure, but not drunk. He knew exactly what he was saying, and he believed every word of it." He heard the voice, but it was small and tinny, like noise from the far end of a tunnel. These kinds of thoughts were starting to feel like tiny buzzing flies he couldn't help but swat. It was unsettling how easily he found it to deny the presence of God. He was supposed to be a man of faith, after all. Why did he find it so hard to believe that angels could be walking the earth? It was because he was turning into a miserable old cynic, that was why. A hypocrite who grinned down from his pulpit every Sunday and preached the good word of the Lord, even though he himself thought the Lord had given up on him years ago. He had joined the church because he'd grown so tired of waking up every day and wondering where the hell his life was going. "You need religion, you sinful boy," his ma always used to say. And eventually he just thrown in the towel and stopped fighting her. He started attending church every Sunday, went to confession on a daily basis, and discovered a love for God that gave him the strength to leave his old life behind. He had become a priest 3 years later. He must have had faith at that point. He couldn't imagine joining the priesthood with anything less than absolute devotion. But his well of belief had dried up years ago, and he could no longer remember how it felt to bask in the glory of the divine. Damien wiped the dust from the tabernacle with a damp rag, staring warily at his reflection. It was the face of a man twice his age. His black hair was slowly giving in to an advancing blanket of gray, and his cheeks had grown sallow and gaunt. It occurred to him that he looked like a corpse that had just crawled out of its grave. He wondered why people still bothered to come to his services, to come see a broken-down man like him. How many years had it been, really? How many years since he'd actually thought of God as something more than just a mythical figure? For a frightening moment, he was staring down a cold, barren hallway, afraid that his entire past was dark and godless. Then, tucked around the corner of the tunnel, he came across a memory that he'd almost forgotten. It was the fading sun through the stained glass that brought him back. He'd been just a boy then, a Cub Scout hiking the Appalachian Trail with the rest of his pack. They'd been walking for hours and were searching for a clearing to pitch their tents and spend the night. As the procession marched on through the wilderness, the sun had cast its speckled light through the treetops, lighting up the forest in those same patches of gray and orange. Damien couldn't remember how he'd gotten separated from the rest of the pack. Maybe he'd stopped to tie his shoe, or fill his water bottle, or take a closer look at the patchy moss crawling up the side of some tree. All he knew was that he looked up once and found himself alone. He should have just followed the trail, but he was 7 and scared, and he wasn't thinking clearly. Night had settled over the woods, and the trees had come alive with a strange, sinister rustling of nature. He clutched his backpack and crunched his way through the blanket of leaves and roots, his eyes flying from side to side. It was pointless. Crickets chirped and leaves crackled, but he couldn't make out anything in the blackness. He didn't even have a flashlight. In his excitement for the trip, he'd forgotten to pack it with his gear the night before. It wasn't the creatures of the forest he feared, like wolves and bears and killer bees. It was the thought of dying that made his skin break out in cold sweat. The thought of wasting away in this wilderness, never to see his friends or family again, never to play with his puppy, never to eat homemade cookies or read scary stories under the covers. He had recognized his mortality for the very first time, and the fear of death had come upon him like a sickness. It was cold, paralyzing. But when he finally slumped against a tree, too exhausted to run any further, he felt a sense of comfort sweep over him. It came out of nowhere, as if someone had draped a warm blanket across his shoulders. He had the distinct feeling that somebody was standing nearby, watching him, but for some reason, this didn't scare him. Whatever it was, this presence felt kind, benevolent. And then, well, he wasn't exactly sure. Richard's story about the angel in the gray suit was probably working its way into his memories. But above him, almost imperceptibly, he thought he had heard the heavy beating of wings. He'd spent the night beneath the tree, sheltered by that invisible presence, too tired to dare venturing further into the woods. And in the morning, they had found him. His scoutmaster had shouted himself hoarse until he came across the missing boy, and he could only remember the next few hours as a blur of faces and voices, some harsh and scolding, others just thankful he was alive. The watchful presence, whatever it had been, was long gone, but the memory of it lingered. Father Damien paused, staring down at the damp rag. Come to think of it, after that camping trip, hadn't he gone to church on his own for the first time in his life? His ma had always had to drag him to their stuffy old chapel on Sundays, but one evening he had walked the whole 3 miles there by himself. He'd never seen the place look so empty. Without all the cranky old ladies and the clouds of incense and the tuneless notes of the choir, the church finally felt like a sacred place to him. After walking down the aisle, he'd gotten to his knees in one of the first pews he came to. For a moment, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. Then he thought of the horrible fear that had gripped him in the woods, and the strange force that had watched over him in those dark hours, and he prayed. Aside from the half-hearted Our Fathers his mom made him mutter before bed, it was his first time praying with intention. It was the first time he had spoken to a higher power and actually believed that somebody was up there listening. He'd grown up, of course, and it had taken years after that for the church to turn his life around. He just wondered why it was so hard for him nowadays to find that faith, that same blind innocence. When he was a kid, it was easy for him to hear a sound in the woods and believe God was watching over him. Now a man had just told him he'd seen an angel, and his only reaction was, he must be drunk. Damien stowed the supplies away with another sigh, his robe sagging on his shoulders. He had had enough of cleaning for one night. It was just about time for him to make the long trip home and crawl back into bed so he could get a few fitful hours of sleep and start all over again tomorrow. Then footsteps sounded out from the rear of the church, and Father Damien turned his head, half expecting to see Richard standing in the doorway. An elderly woman came clunking up the steps instead, her withered hands clenching a thin walking stick. He felt a minor annoyance at having his evening plans interrupted, but Father Damien was relieved to see that he knew this woman. Maria Delgado had been appearing more and more frequently these days, and she always picked a pew as close to the altar as she could get, singing and praying and swaying to the sound of the choir. It was difficult for her to move, but she never asked for help from those around her. When it was time to rise, she would prop herself up on her cane and lift her head to the ceiling, belting out every psalm with as much force as she could muster. Damien imagined that she must have been a real beauty when she was younger, but age had mottled her skin and given her a permanent stoop. The only youthful bit of her that remained was her smile, but Lord, what a smile it was. Wide and bright and mirthful, her teeth were still a pristine shade of white, even after age had taken so much from her. It was the smile of a woman who had many years left to live. Unfortunately, Father Damien knew that Maria didn't have nearly that long. She had had a stroke several months ago and was slowly losing her eyesight to some unpronounceable brain disease. She would often talk with him after sermons about how she was coping with the pain, how she was trying her hardest to keep her faith in God, even when she knew the end was coming. Father Damien liked Maria, but every time she visited, he could feel his heart breaking. She wasn't the first old lady who had withered away in these pews, and she wasn't the first person Damien had seen whose faith couldn't save her. The priest watched as Maria hobbled up to the first pew, taking a careful seat near the aisle. "Buenos noches, Padre," she said. "I have come to pray again." "Good evening to you too, Mrs. Delgado," Damien replied. "How are you feeling? Still in a lot of pain?" She peered up at him, squinting. "There's still pain, but I am okay," she answered. "I've made my peace with the world." After a moment's thought, her lips parted, and Damien caught a glimpse of her youthful smile. "Soon I'll be with the angels." The priest flinched at the last word, but the movement was slight, and he doubted that Maria had noticed. "What about you, Padre?" the old woman asked warmly. "How are you feeling today?" Dear Lord, Damien thought, where on earth could he begin? How could he possibly say that he was too skeptical to believe in angels, even when a man had sat down in his church and claimed to have seen them with his own 2 eyes? How could he say that he'd become a cynical old bastard with no idea where his life was going? How could he say that he found it impossible to open his mind any more, to believe in the presence of the divine? He couldn't say any of that out loud, especially not to this sweet, saintly woman who would be dead and buried in a matter of months. His lips twisted into a phony sermon smile, but he found that he couldn't bring himself to lie to this woman, and the smile crumpled at once. "To tell you the truth, Mrs. Delgado, I've been better," he said. "I have all these questions hanging over me lately, and I don't think they'll ever be answered." Maria let out a chuckle, her cheeks crinkling into that bemused smile of hers. "We all have questions, Padre," she replied. "Even the Blessed Mother Teresa had her moments of doubt. We spend our whole lives searching for answers, but we can never find them all. That's why they call it faith." Her eyes twinkled. "You of all people should know that." Of course I know, Father Damien thought. It's just that faith is harder and harder for me to find these days. The church fell into silence, and for a while, Damien thought that the old woman was praying. Her beady eyes had glazed over, and it looked as though she had fallen into some holy reverie. And then she stirred, turning to look at Father Damien. We all have angels watching over us, you know, she said. I can tell that your faith is shaken, Padre, but they're here, all around us. They guard us and protect us, and when our time comes, they take us away. She reached up suddenly, her gnarled fingers grabbing onto his own with surprising strength. You must believe, Padre. You must believe. Her touch awoke a bitter, aching memory he'd tried to keep dormant, and all at once he was back in the dim shadows of that hospital room, and his ma was clinging to his hand with emaciated fingers. Her skin was pale and blotchy, but his eyes were too teary to make out more than the blurred outline of her face. He had on his priestly cassock and was mumbling the words of her last rites, but his ma was having none of it. She writhed and squirmed on her bed sheets, digging her nails into his palm. You're no man of God, she spat at him. God is just. God rewards the holy and punishes the corrupt, and you've corrupted me. Why else would he take me? Why else would he take one of his devout children? I love you, he'd wanted to say. I love you and I forgive you. But he couldn't bring himself to speak to the shrieking woman on the bed, the woman who had done her best to force religion on him all his life, only to tear it away with her dying screams. Now he stared down at Maria and found that tears were spilling down his beaten cheeks. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. You're blessed, he whispered to her. You're blessed and I'm not. I've got the congregation and the church community, but they don't know me outside the walls of this chapel. I have no other family, no friends, no one but my dear old ma, who's lying 6 feet under in the chapel crypt, and would probably still be damning me if she had the breath. How am I supposed to believe that God ever cared for me, and that he sent angels to watch over me, to keep me safe? Shh, Maria replied, stroking his fingers. You are blessed, Padre. You have your angels, and I have mine. Open your heart to God, and you will see them for what they are. All you must do is have some faith. The old woman's smile was wide and beautiful, and in those moments, she was transformed, her age and her illness unraveling from her like a spool of thread. I want to, Father Damien thought, weeping, still gripping her withered hand. I want to believe. I want to have faith. I want it more than anything in the world. I just don't know how I can find it. After Maria had left, after Father Damien had finished dusting off the altar and straightening the hymnals, he closed the chapel doors behind him and locked them for the night. He had changed back into casual clothing and left his robes in the vestry for the next day. It was a 10-minute walk from his church to the nearest train station, and he didn't like drawing attention to himself out in public. On his way to the station, he passed a group of Hispanic teenagers in do-rags and muscle shirts who were sitting on the front steps of an apartment complex. They nodded at the priest as he walked by, and Damien gave them his best forced smile. He had never felt entirely at home in this neighborhood, but at least the local residents always treated him with respect. For Maria and the other members of this community, faith was something to be admired. He wondered if their opinion of him would change if they knew how his faith was shaken. By the time he reached the train station and purchased a ticket to Brooklyn, it was almost 6 in the evening. As he stood at the edge of the platform, waiting for the train to arrive, he noticed a dusty blue newspaper box propped up against the side of the building. The headline drew his eye, and he walked over to peer through the dirty window at the sheet of paper beneath. He caught his breath as he read the title of the cover story. Accident on Tapanzi Bridge kills 1, injures 3. Fumbling for some change, he dropped a few quarters into the box and pulled out one of the newspapers. Below the headline was a professional snapshot of the totaled car, around which hovered several policemen and a few scared bystanders. One of the officers had his face turned toward the camera and was shouting something to a person behind the photographer. The dead man's body wasn't shown, of course, but Father Damien could just barely see Richard McLean standing in the crowd of spectators. The twitchy man looked numb with horror, although the expression on his face wasn't much different from the others around him. Everything in this photograph matched Richard's story to a T, except for one thing. There was no man in a gray suit. Father Damien scanned the picture a dozen times, but no matter how desperately he searched, he couldn't find Richard's angel. There was a sharp blast of a whistle in the distance, and Father Damien turned to see the train making its way toward the station, sunlight flashing off its metal skin. It almost looked as if it were bursting through the sinking orange disk on the horizon. When the train pulled up beside the platform and ground to a halt, Father Damien stepped up to board it, holding his ticket in one sweaty hand and the newspaper in the other. As he picked his seat in the center of the train carriage, his eyes fell again to the glaring headline. It seemed clear that no matter what Richard claimed to have seen, angels weren't walking the streets of New York. So what had happened that night on the bridge? Had Richard simply imagined the whole thing? Had some combination of alcohol and sleep deprivation addled his brain? Or was it just easier for him to see the events of that night as an act from above, rather than a simple, tragic accident? Hard, undeniable evidence. That was all Damien had wanted. Ever since his ma had slipped away from him, ever since he had watched her seize on her bedsheets and pray for God to end her pain, he had needed answers. How could his mother, someone so pious, someone so devoted to the church, have been snatched away so suddenly? How could God have let her die when she was barely out of her 40s, when Damien himself was trying to love her again, to love God again? The only answers he could think of were that God didn't exist, or he didn't care. And both answers were so dangerous that for a while he tried to ignore those doubting voices. But he had gone through the motions, preaching and praying and carrying out the same tedious rituals day in and day out. And with each passing day he could feel his faith ebbing just a little bit more. When he had first taken up the vocation, he didn't need proof to know that God was watching over him. He just knew. Believing was effortless. But after Ma's passing, he needed more than blind reassurance from the words of dead prophets. He needed the one thing that priests could never have, the one quality that was so intrinsically absent from the notion of faith. He needed proof. I want to believe, he thought again, clutching the folded newspaper against his chest. Oh God, why is it so hard to believe? The train began to pull away from the station, and Father Damien stared out the window as they passed the platform, watching as the line of figures became a blur of patchy colors. He wondered how many of them believed in God, believed in angels, believed that miracles still existed outside of the Bible. He tried to catch each of their faces as he passed, but it was like trying to hold on to a patch of mist with his bare hands. Father Damien settled back and stared down the length of the carriage, watching as the other passengers took their seats and waited for the conductor to punch their tickets. Many of them were also reading newspapers in the fading bursts of sunlight. Two old women in the seat behind him spoke in hushed voices, letting out the occasional burst of laughter, and a teenager in a blue hooded sweatshirt was sprawled across the pair of seats next to him. They were an eclectic group of people, brought together only by their common destination, and in some ways they reminded him of his congregation. At the far end of the train, a man was staring out his window with a blank expression on his face. He had a cup of coffee in his lap, but he didn't sip from it. There was nothing particularly special about him, but for some reason Father Damien felt drawn to him. The priest tried to imagine what was going on behind those impassive eyes. Damien pictured the man sitting in a cubicle, trapped, like he was, in a life he'd grown tired of. He worked in tech support, maybe, or local government. It didn't matter. Life in the office was arduous, grueling. Sometimes it was nearly enough to drive him mad, but every night he would come home and kiss his wife and feed his dog and tuck his children into bed, and they were the ones who kept him going, the ones who kept the fire in his heart from dwindling. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't an angel or a holy servant of God. But as long as he lived with that spark inside of him, he would be living with love and hope. And hadn't Damien always preached to his congregation that hope was God's greatest gift to man? Maybe I've been going about this all wrong, he thought. Maybe I shouldn't be looking for angels to find proof of God's existence. Maybe the proof is all around me, and I just haven't opened my eyes. As if in answer, the sun chose that moment to dip beneath the horizon, leaving the faintest sliver of orange light above the skyline. The dying sunshine settled around the man's head in a hazy corona of light, and to Father Damien, it almost looked like a halo. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe. The author was kind enough to share this story with me. Don't forget to check out David Farrow's other works. You can find him on Reddit at r/DavidFarrowWrites. You can support the author by visiting his YouTube channel, The Farrowverse, where he's currently uploading narrations of his amazing series, The Neverglades. Speaking of The Neverglades, you can find The Neverglades Volume 1 and 2, as well as Fleshy Sensoria on Amazon. I'll include links to everything in the description. Thanks for listening, and have a great night, everyone.